Jon Stewart tears apart Trump's art of the deal Iran strategy that backfired badly. Jon Stewart walked onto that stage with a checkerboard. Not a script, not a podium, a literal checkerboard. One side chess, one side checkers. And in 22 minutes, he used that board to explain something that weeks of news coverage had completely failed to communicate. Trump's Iran strategy isn't complicated. It isn't fifth-dimensional chess. It's not even checkers. It's a game that keeps changing its own rules every time the player starts losing. And right now, everyone is losing, except the people who wrote the rules. Here's what you need to understand before any of this makes sense. In 2018, Trump pulled the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal. The JCPOA, an agreement that had taken more than a decade of serious diplomacy to construct, involving the US, Russia, China, the UK, France, and Germany all sitting at the same table, Trump called it the worst deal ever made. He promised he would replace it with something so much better, so much stronger, so much more favorable to American interests that the world would wonder how anyone had accepted anything less. That promise is now the most expensive sentence Donald Trump has ever spoken. Because here's what that promise has produced. A war. Thousands of dead Iranians, 13 dead American soldiers, a closed Strait of Hormuz, gas prices that have gutted working families across the country, and negotiations that are currently circling toward a deal that multiple analysts say will probably end up worse than the one Trump tore up in the first place. That's the setup. That's the foundation Jon Stewart walked onto that stage to dismantle. And he did it with a prop from a game store and 22 minutes of the most surgical comedy in television history. Let's go back to the beginning. Because the moment this strategy started unraveling wasn't last week. It wasn't last month. The unraveling started the moment Trump assumed that strength alone was a substitute for preparation. When he pulled out of the JCPOA, the calculation was simple. Iran would be economically strangled by sanctions. They'd come crawling back, they'd agree to anything, and Trump would walk out of the room holding a deal so dominant it would make Obama's agreement look like a parking ticket. That's the art of the deal approach. You make the other side desperate. You make them afraid, and then you offer them just enough relief that they'll accept your terms and call it their own victory. It works sometimes. In real estate, with contractors who can't afford to walk away from a job, with subcontractors who have mortgages and employees to pay. It does not work the same way with a sovereign nation that has been preparing for American economic pressure for 4 decades. Iran is not a contractor who needs the job. Iran is a country that has built its entire political identity around resistance to exactly the kind of pressure Trump was applying. And here's where Stewart's checkerboard becomes something more than a prop. He wasn't just making a joke about Trump's strategic incoherence. He was illustrating something structurally true about how this approach to negotiation works when the other side doesn't follow the script. Trump demanded unconditional surrender. On March 6th, he posted it in capital letters. UN conditional surrender. Not a deal, not a framework, surrender. Like this was 1945, and America had just finished defeating an empire with nuclear weapons. Iran's response was to close the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that strait. And Iran just shut the door. The gas prices you're paying right now, the inflation that's grinding through household budgets across this country, a significant portion of that traces back to that door closing. And Trump's strategy for getting it back open has been a masterclass in exactly the kind of deal-making that Art of the Deal warned everyone else never to fall for. Here's the timeline, and you need to sit with how fast this moves because each turn of it looks like confidence until you see the next one. Trump sets a deadline. Iran doesn't comply. Trump extends the deadline, citing very good and productive conversations. Iran's own state media immediately reports that no such conversations took place. Trump threatens to destroy Iranian power plants, oil wells, bridges, desalination infrastructure. Iran says the strait belongs to Iran and will not be open to enemies. Trump announces Iran has asked for a ceasefire. IRGC says no ceasefire was requested. A 45-day ceasefire gets proposed through Pakistani mediation. Iran says no, they want a permanent solution. Trump says the proposal wasn't good enough. The ceasefire collapses. And then on April 7th, Trump writes something that Stewart had to read out loud on national television because no other context could contain it. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back. That sentence, that specific sentence, was meant to be a threat. Instead, it got memed by Iranian Lego fans, who built the destroyed civilization in Lego form and posted it online. Iran out-memed the President of the United States. And that moment, that specific moment of a country under military and economic assault, finding time to clap back in the language of internet humor, that tells you everything about how this strategy landed on the other side. Stewart's breakdown of the art of the deal framework is worth understanding in full, because it's not just comedy. It's actually an accurate description of a negotiating philosophy that only functions under specific conditions. You start with an impossible demand. You issue consequences. You claim credit for any movement, no matter how small. You redefine victory to match whatever actually happened. And then you announce you've won and move the goalposts before anyone can verify the claim. Stewart called it a cycle of demands and threats and premature declarations of victory that gives the negotiator enough wiggle room to claim success at almost any point, regardless of the actual outcome. That's not mockery. That's an accurate structural description of what has happened in these negotiations for weeks. Trump told Bloomberg that Iran had agreed to an unlimited suspension of its nuclear program. Iran had agreed to no such thing. Trump told CBS that Tehran agreed to everything. They had agreed to nothing. Trump told Axios a meeting would probably happen over the weekend and a deal would come within a day or two. No meeting happened, no deal came, and each time a claim fell apart, the next claim arrived before anyone had fully processed that the previous one was fiction. Now here's the part that nobody in Trump's political circle wants to acknowledge publicly, but that defense analysts and foreign policy experts are saying clearly. The deal that eventually emerges from these negotiations, if one emerges, will likely look a lot like the JCPOA. The same deal Trump spent years calling the worst agreement in American diplomatic history. The same deal he withdrew from to start this entire chain of events. The framework currently being discussed involves a pause on enrichment, sanctions relief for Iran, security guarantees. Sound familiar? It should, because that's the structure of what Obama negotiated in 2015. The difference is that in 2015, America sat alongside Russia, China, the UK, France, and Germany, a unified front that gave the agreement the weight of the world's major powers. Today, Russia and China are firmly in Iran's corner. The unified front doesn't exist anymore. America is negotiating without the leverage that the multilateral coalition provided. And Iran knows it. Iran's negotiating position is stronger now than it was in 2015, not weaker. Because they've absorbed the strikes, they've closed the strait, they've demonstrated their ability to inflict real economic pain on the global oil market, and they're still at the table on their own terms. That's not the result of maximum pressure working. That's the result of maximum pressure failing to produce the unconditional surrender it promised and having to settle for whatever framework Iran will accept. Stewart didn't just make jokes about this. He named the cost. Thousands of innocent Iranians are dead. 13 American soldiers are dead. The credibility of the United States as a reliable partner in multilateral agreements has been damaged in ways that will affect American diplomacy for years. The world economy has absorbed a shock that ordinary people are paying for at gas stations and grocery stores. And the final deal, whenever it comes, will require justifying all of those costs against an outcome that at best approximates what existed before any of this started. That's the ledger. That's what Art of the Deal Iran edition has actually produced. Not a triumph, a cycle. Demands, threats, declarations of premature victory, revised demands, new threats, new declarations. And at the end of it, a deal that the person who demanded unconditional surrender will present as total victory, and most of his supporters will accept as such because the alternative requires acknowledging that the whole strategy was the problem from the beginning. There's something Jon Stewart said at the very end of that monologue that deserves more attention than it got. He said, "Keep moving to outrun the darkness." It sounds like a punchline. It's actually the most precise thing anyone has said about this presidency's entire approach to consequences. Keep moving. Don't stop long enough for the gap between the claim and the reality to fully register. Don't let the audience compare what was promised to what was delivered, because by the time they do, there's a new claim in the air that resets the conversation. It's not a governing philosophy. It's an escape strategy. And it works until the darkness catches up. In this case, the darkness is a closed strait, a growing death toll, an economy feeling real pain, and a negotiation that is trending toward proving that the deal you spent years calling the worst in history was actually better than anything you could achieve by blowing it up. The checkerboard stays on the table, the game keeps changing, and somewhere in Tehran, they're still playing by their own rules. Jon Stewart saw it clearly. The question is whether anyone in the seats that actually matter is paying attention. What comes next is the part that will define this chapter of American foreign policy forever. Because if the final deal looks like the JCPOA, If the framework that ends this conflict is structurally similar to the agreement Trump tore up and called a disaster, then someone is going to have to explain what the last several years were for, what the dead soldiers were for, what the dead civilians were for, what the closed strait was for, what the economic pain was for. And that explanation cannot be the art of the deal. Because the art of the deal says you walk away with something better than what was on the table when you walked in. Right now, the table looks remarkably similar to what it looked like before any of this started. Except everyone is poorer, and some people are not coming back. That's not deal-making. That's what happens when a negotiating philosophy designed for contractors and real estate transactions gets applied to geopolitics without understanding that the other side has its own history, its own leverage, and absolutely nothing to lose by waiting. Stewart tore it apart with a checkerboard and 22 minutes. History is going to need a lot longer. But the conclusion is already visible, and it isn't art, it's cost.